Erev Tov, and welcome to A Turn in Israel, Politics and Society in Today's Jewish State. Our sponsors are the Contra Costa Jewish Community Center, Congregation Beth Emek, and Beth Hayim Congregation, in partnership with Congregation B'nai Shalom, Congregation B'nai Tikva, Diablo Valley Hadassah, and Temple Isaiah. And to start, I'd like to, on behalf of all the sponsors and co-sponsors, wish everyone a healthy and happy Passover, which of course begins next week. We asked our speaker, Fred Rosenbaum, to address the Israeli November elections for the Knesset members and the formation of the new government, which according to political scientists, is the most far-right government in Israel's history. And we did that before the current mass protests that we've seen for the past few weeks, which are primarily have been against the proposed judicial reform legislation. This is a very tense time in Israel. Many of us have close friends who share their opinions one way or the other. And I'd like to share what I would call a motto, a slogan, which I got from a Hillel house in the early 2000 period during the Second Intifada. And it was, wherever I stand with the people of Israel. So with us today are people from all different directions of the political spectrum and how you feel. As we always do, we ask that you don't unmute yourself because we want to hear from our guest speaker, Fred Rosenbaum, but you can ask him questions, which we'll be glad to respond to at the end of his formal presentation by typing them in the chat function, which you can find at the bottom of your computer screen. Please, when doing so, please be dignified in your question. And so we want to keep this so that we feel open. We don't want to censor anyone, but we also want to, as we say, wherever we stand with the people of Israel. Like to point out that on April 17th at 7 p.m., the community is joining together for the Holocaust commemoration for Yom HaShoah, which will be hybrid, both online and in person at Temple Isaiah in Lafayette. We also will be celebrating Israel's 75th birthday with a festival with a lot of youth and family programming, as well as programming for adults. And you can see all of this on the website, the programming website of the Contra Costa JCC, under onetent.org. Thank you very much for joining us. And in case you have to leave early or you have friends who we got over 250 RSVPs, this presentation will be found at the JCC website in a day or two. And now to officially welcome Fred Rosenbaum is James Holtz of Congregation Beth Emek's Israel and World Jury Committee. Jim, thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Our speaker this evening is Fred Rosenbaum, who is quite noted. He's an author, a historian, and an adult educator. He founded and directed Lehrhaus Judaica, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and it's described as the largest Jewish adult education center in the Western United States. It still continues. It's the new Lehrhaus, and it provides meaningful courses and lectures. Fred grew up in Queens, New York, and earned a bachelor's degree at Washington University in St. Louis. Subsequently, he studied the history of Nazi Germany as a Fulbright Fellow in West Germany. He earned a master's degree in European history at the University of California, Berkeley. And he's an award-winning author. He's written a number of books, including Cosmopolitans, A Social and Cultural History of the Jews of San Francisco Bay, and he's co-authored several memoirs of Jewish partisans. As Riva explained, please share your questions on the chat function located at the bottom of your computer screen. Following his presentation, Rabbi Dan Globat will lead the Q&A. It's now our pleasure to welcome Fred Rosenbaum on A Turn in Israel, Politics and Society in Today's Jewish State, which I'm sure is a topic of much interest to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you for entrusting me with this sensitive subject. I feel a special responsibility as a Jewish educator tonight. You know, when Riva and I planned this talk a few months ago, we thought it would be timely. We didn't know how timely it would turn out to be. Yesterday will go down as one of the most momentous days in Israeli history. As you all know, in the face of massive protests and strikes across almost all sectors of society, Netanyahu stepped back from his judicial overhaul, at least for a month. He said it was to prevent a civil war. That's a reprieve, but Israel is still being torn apart from within. An internal reckoning, potentially reshaping society. Since 1948, there has been a delicate balance between a homeland specifically for Jews and a democracy with equal rights for all. Now, powerful extremist cabinet members, several with criminal records, aggressively seek to shift the status quo toward exclusionary nationalism and fundamentalist Judaism. They advocate a far weaker judiciary, curtailing the rights of the LGBTQ community, further marginalizing non-Orthodox Jews, increasing government funding of yeshivas, expanding and arming the Jewish settlements in the West Bank, and more. Adamant opposition has been voiced by thousands of retired Israeli military and intelligence officers, including all 10 living former commanders of the Air Force. Hundreds of reservists, including dozens of jet fighter pilots, have failed to report for training exercises. The Attorney General and all 7 of her living predecessors have excoriated the government's proposals. Even one of Israel's leading diplomats, its consul general in New York, spoke out publicly against his own government. Scores of high-tech executives and investors have begun to move their capital and their companies out of the country. But things really came to a boil Sunday evening. The Minister of Defense, widely respected for his military experience and sound judgment, had announced that the reservists' walkout had harmed national security. And as you know, he was fired. 150 spontaneous demonstrations sprang up, facilitated by the messaging platform WhatsApp, and brought the country to a standstill. The Ben Gurion Airport was closed. The entire university system announced a stoppage of teaching and research. Led by the mammoth trade union Histadrut, about 1 million workers, a quarter of the labor force, went out on strike. Let's see the first slide. Now here, I just wanted to show you some images of these protests, which for months have taken place. The largest demonstrations in the country's history. Hundreds of thousands have marched every week in protest. Now, on the top photo, I wanted to show you that because the Israeli flags are everywhere. The opposition protesters have appropriated the Israeli flag as their symbol. Now, we see in the bottom photo, we see women who are dressed up like the Handmaid's Tale characters. Why is that? Because it's a protest against the misogyny of some of the proposals that are in the process of being pushed through the Knesset. Let's look at the next screen, if you can scroll down. This gives you some idea of the scale of these protests. And they cover almost every sector of society. But I do want to mention the one group that is lacking, and that is the Palestinians. They have not joined with the others in this protest. First of all, the organizers of the protest banned the display of the Palestinian flag. Also, many of the Palestinians, have just given up in terms of the Israeli political system, and they feel that there have just been too many false promises. So this is considered a problem in demonstrations among many who feel that the key to this problem would be, some kind of, some kind of alliance between the Palestinians and the Israelis. By the way, I'm speaking here of the Palestinians within Israel proper, the Israeli Arabs, I should say. Okay, you can remove that screen. How has the government and its supporters responded? They say, and I take them seriously, that this clamorous backlash of anarchists, as they call them, which has gotten worldwide attention, is irresponsible during this period of rising anti-Semitism. Also irresponsible, they say, is the refusal of servicemen to report for duty. They rightly point out that the Knesset was freely elected and claim it's the activist Supreme Court that has been undemocratic, thwarting the will of the people. They believe a much harder line toward the Palestinians is warranted, given their violence, corruption, intransigence. They argue that a swing to the far right is a global phenomenon, which Americans themselves experienced under Trump. And they contend that the ultra-Orthodox parties have every right to get the most they can for their constituency, that they don't benefit from the state's generous support of universities and cultural institutions. They maintain, too, that in a Jewish state, Torah learning should be paramount. Tonight, I'll try to explain how and why this existential crisis arose. But I want to focus not only on those forcefully opposed to the new regime's agenda, but I want to understand those who emphatically support it. First, though, some background on Israel's unique parliamentary democracy. The presidency is largely ceremonial, nothing like the powerful American or French president. Authority resides in the 120-member Knesset, and especially the party leaders of the governing coalition, because they almost always head the ministries. The executive branch is thus formed by the majority of the legislative branch. Bibi is the head of both. So there's really no separation of powers between them. The Knesset is the only lawmaking body. There is no equivalent of a Senate. And there's no constitution to restrain the Knesset. Instead, there are 13 basic laws, mostly on human rights, passed over the years by the parliament itself. Nor is there anything similar to American state governments, which of course have wide-ranging jurisdiction. The only break on the Knesset has been the Supreme Court, which has overturned legislation 22 times since the mid-1990s, actually fewer than high courts in most other democracies. As you all know, the new coalition is pushing through a bill that would allow a bare majority of the Knesset, 61, to override a Supreme Court ruling. Thus, the High Court could be prevented from disqualifying cabinet ministers who are convicted felons or a prime minister under indictment. It could be unable to protect Palestinians from being uprooted from their homes to make room for Jewish settlements. The court could be blocked from striking down a law allowing doctors to withhold treatment from a gay person. Now, how are the members of the powerful, perhaps soon to be all-powerful Knesset elected? The entire country is a single legislative district. It's not as if several MKs, members of Knesset, it's not as if several MKs represent Tel Aviv and others Haifa. Rather, they all represent Israel as a whole. So again, unlike the United States, regional interests have little impact. The voters do not choose individual candidates, but rather a political party, and its percentage of votes is translated into Knesset seats. 10% of the vote yields 12 seats. Usually about 40 parties compete, many on single issues, such as legalizing marijuana. Normally, around a dozen gain representation, far more than most other parliaments. It's said there are 3 Zionists in a room, there are 4 political parties. Now, before the election, each party prepares a list in descending order of those who will go to the Knesset. There is suspense about the size of the vote for each party. But for most politicians, it's a foregone conclusion about whether or not they will become MKs. If Likud, say, is expected to get about 30 seats, only those in the slots between 28 and 32 have any uncertainty. What I'm saying is that the voters choose the party chooses the MKs. Usually the chair of, I see a question, what is an MK? Member of Knesset. It's usually the chair of the largest party that's mandated by the president to get other parties to join in a governing coalition, at least 61. The intense bargaining can last for many weeks, often revolving around which party leaders will be awarded which ministries in exchange for joining. The leader of a small party, if needed to reach 61, can thus be a kingmaker. Now, not adequately appreciated outside of Israel is the electoral threshold, 3.25%, equaling 4 seats. If a party falls below that, about 155,000 votes in the last election, it receives no seats at all. See, another question, how many MKs? 120. But getting back to the electoral threshold, does this mean that if a party obtains 3% of the electorate and falls short, its 143,000 votes don't count for anything? Not necessarily. Like-minded parties can agree in advance to join together for the election, as if they were a single party, and thus retain votes on their ideological side that would otherwise be lost. Let me give an example. Two small parties running separately and receiving 80,000 votes, about 2% each, would each get nothing. They fell well below the threshold. Had they united, they'd have 160,000, giving them 4 seats, 2 for each party, and they can go their own way after the election. This dynamic of the electoral threshold is likely what swung the November election to the Netanyahu bloc, and I'll explain. 3 small radical right-wing parties ran as one, the religious Zionists, and received 11% of the vote, giving them 14 seats, the second largest party in Netanyahu's coalition of 64. Had they run separately, probably 2 would not have passed the threshold, and the remaining one might have gotten only 10 seats, and the election would have been another stalemate. Now, these 3 bullheaded party leaders were at odds with one another, but Netanyahu brokered an agreement for them to unite. He wanted to strengthen them as much as he could. He saw them as the only way to give his bloc a majority, since he had burned his bridges with the center parties and even the small traditional right-wing parties. Now, aside from his insatiable hunger for power, he may also have come to genuinely embrace some of the principles of the extremists, as has his son, Yair, who has obscenely compared the protesters to Nazi stormtroopers. That Jewish supremacists, these 14 MKs of the religious Zionists, that they have become part of the governing coalition and received major ministries is unprecedented. No past Israeli leader would have legitimized these firebrands, 2 of whom have been on Israel's terrorist watch list. About a quarter of the electorate voted for Likud, knowing it would almost definitely have to partner with these rabble-rousers. Let's look at the next slide and we'll see how Netanyahu put this together. Now, I just said that people knew that the only way Netanyahu could come to power would be with these religious Zionists. I want to direct your attention first to the lower photo. That's the campaign poster. You see Netanyahu on the left of the 2 gentlemen. Okay, is it possible to enlarge this image, if you can? Okay, let's look at that one. Thank you, thank you. You see Netanyahu is on the left. The person on the right is Itamar Ben-Gvir, one of the 3 party leaders. I'm going to come back to him in much more detail later, but he's one of these extremist party leaders. Look at the slogan here. Well, first, that the 2 of them are matched together shows you quite a connection. But look at the slogan. This says, "Only with Ben-Gvir do you have Bibi. Only with Ben Gvir is there Bibi. So everyone knows that that's the way he's going to come to power, Bibi. And yet, he received a quarter of the electorate. Let's look now at the top image, and I'll show you how he put together the 64. So Likud received 32, which was pretty strong. You know, it was expected, something like that. If we move toward the right, we see in the light blue the religious Zionists. They're a big piece of this coalition, aren't they? With 14 seats. And then you have the two ultra-religious parties. I'm going to discuss them in more detail in a moment. Shas is the Sephardi ultra-religious party. UTJ, United Torah Judaism, is the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party. This alone is remarkable, that the ultra-religious have 18 seats. If you add them to the religious Zionists, that's half the coalition, that's 32. Okay, let's keep this slide up. I just want to make one comment about this connection to the religious Zionists of the Likud. This dramatic shift within the Israeli right calls to mind the Republican Party in the United States, which in recent years became beholden to the belligerent populism of one faction. So is the Likud coming under the sway of a radical hyper-nationalist force. Now, let's look at the left side. Personality clashes on the left led to political disaster. Two small progressive parties, Labor and Meretz, could have run together, but did not. Labor, which you see in the dark red, the next to the last party on the left, Labor, which has declined precipitously for decades, passed the threshold, but won a pathetic 4 seats. In the 1960s, they would sometimes have 50 seats. Meretz, in the Knesset for 30 years, fell just short and now has no representation at all. That's why you don't see Meretz on this chart. The 151,000 votes for this left-wing party, which would have yielded at least 3 seats had they been added to Labor, were lost. Similarly, the 4 Arab parties failed to unite, and 2 of them did not reach the 3.25%. So you have 2 Arab parties here with 5 each. Had they united, they probably would have gotten close to 15. Okay, you can remove that. Now, there is more here than the cunning political maneuvering of Netanyahu and the hapless strategies of the left. Israel has been moving rightwards for almost half a century, and especially in the last 2 decades. Until 1977, it was governed by a semi-socialist coalition led by the very large Labor Party. I think their high point was actually 56 seats. They were joined by a smaller party to their left and a religious party, which was Orthodox, but not ultra-Orthodox, and centrist politically. But seismic demographic shifts would eventually destroy this long-time ruling framework. The dynamic right-wing Menachem Begin, although from Poland, turned to the Mizrahim, Jews who had fled from North Africa and the Middle East, and would soon approach a majority of the Jewish population. After making Aliyah, They often had to live in squalid transit camps. They were looked down upon as second-class citizens and derided as chakchakim, meaning riffraff. They resented the condescending, sometimes even racist Ashkenazi elite, represented by the Labor Party, an elite known as the Israeli WASPs. Yes, WASPs. White Ashkenazi Sabras with protectia. Protectia meaning inside connections. The Mizrahim had an affinity for Begin, though. They were outside the establishment like him. He listened to their grievances, and his reverence for traditional Judaism, unlike the secular labor politicians, resonated with them. Begin finally triumphed in 1977, and since then, 45 years, with a few exceptions, Likud and its smaller right-wing allies, along with the very fast-growing ultra-Orthodox parties, would hold power. The Israeli left has been moribund for years. And the real Israeli political divide, it's not between right and left, it's between right and center. Now, this notion of stick it to the Ashkenazi elite still reverberates today and explains part of the anger toward the Supreme Court justices who are mostly secular and of European origin. The rising strength of the Mizrahim has coincided with the exponential growth of the Haredim, as the ultra-Orthodox are known, who average between 6 and 7 children per family. They now represent 1/6 of Israel's Jewish population. And according to leading demographers, they will be 1/3 of the Jewish population by the middle of this century. And by 2060, half the Jewish children in Israel will be Haredim. Yet another demographic trend boosted the nationalist camp, as the right wing calls itself. The immigration of almost 1 million Jews from the former Soviet Union, beginning in the 1990s, now comprising 12% of the electorate. Many have an antipathy to the left, which some conflate with the hated communist society that they fled from. They formed their own right-wing party, Israel Our Home, headed by the brash Avigdor Lieberman, and have become critical in Israeli elections. I'm going to return to them in another context in a minute. But demography is not destiny. Other factors pushed Israel to the right. The collapse of the Oslo Accords, followed by the devastating Second Intifada, convinced many that the two-state solution, long advocated by the progressives, was unrealistic and dangerous. In 2007, Hamas, Muslim fundamentalists, with a declared goal of destroying Israel, came to power in Gaza and frequently shot rockets to the Negev and coastal plain, resulting in 2 wars. The Iranian-backed terrorist militia Hezbollah took over South Lebanon. They sent 4,000 missiles into the Galilee in 2006, killing over 100 Israelis and precipitating a second Lebanon war. And in the past decade, Iran has come perilously close to developing nuclear weapons. Netanyahu, prime minister for 15 years, 12 years consecutively, from 2009 to 2021, provided assurance for many Israelis, a steady hand at the helm amidst this angry sea. He seemed adept at calibrating the proper response to Palestinian terror. Serious punishment without undue provocation, while mindful of maintaining the special relationship with the United States. Let's see the next slide, please. These are campaign posters for Netanyahu, and I think they're very revealing about his appeal. Now, the top one says, Likud Chazak, Yisrael Chazakah. This is, when Likud is strong, Israel is strong. The second one says Chazak b'bitachon, strong in defense, security. You hear this word bitachon always in Israel. The Minister of Defense is Sar HaBitachon. You can totally understandable that security is primary. And then Chazak b'kalkala, strong economy. Now, look at this. There are 4 sentences in these 2 campaign posters, and all of them have the word Chazak, strength. In biblical Hebrew, it even connotes courage and a kind of spiritual boldness that comes from God. So he represents this kind of security and steadiness. He's been there that long. Okay, you can remove that slide. Thank you. Now, also under his watch, the startup nation became a global leader in technology. Despite the high cost of living, and especially in housing, and the departure of too many talented young people, overall, the standard of living has risen. Vital diplomatic and economic initiatives were undertaken in Asia, Africa, Latin America, including the normalization of relations with Morocco, followed, of course, by the Abraham Accords with the UAE and Bahrain. Speaking flawless English, Netanyahu became a fixture on the world stage. I'm sure you remember his eloquent address before a joint session of Congress, 2015, making a forceful case against President Obama's nuclear deal with Iran. Among Israeli politicians, he seemed to be, as another campaign slogan put it, in a league of his own. So why did he have to fight for his political life beginning in 2019? Recall, there was a deadlock in 3 consecutive elections. And then in March 2021, he was voted out of power. He returned last December, but to repeat, only by joining with parties that would normally be considered too extreme to be in a governing coalition. As you know, he was indicted for corruption in 2019 and is the defendant in a trial that will last many more years. The allegations, bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, sound grave, but he could have avoided prison with a plea bargain, admitting to lesser charges, paying a fine, and agreeing to a suspension from politics for a few years. But he stubbornly rejected that, claiming no wrongdoing at all, and blaming the left-wing media. He would have used the words witch hunt if that were a similar expression in Hebrew. Now, several of his longtime coalition partners objected to someone under indictment serving as prime minister. And they also wanted to use his legal troubles to advance their own careers. So they deserted him. There was also an interesting ideological rift in his coalition by 2019, necessitating him to seek new allies. The key right-wing party, headed by Avigdor Lieberman, whom I mentioned earlier, the one for Jews from the former Soviet Union, they bolted the Netanyahu bloc. A hardline nationalist, Lieberman is also staunchly secular and demanded that ultra-Orthodox youths not be exempted from military service, which is compulsory for other Israelis. This, of course, was an anathema to the two ultra-religious parties, which then had 16 seats. Lieberman had only 5, but his defection left Bibi 1 seat short of a majority. A former close ally of Netanyahu, he single-handedly brought down the coalition. In fact, Bibi has been so polarizing that the 8-party coalition formed by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid in 2021 had little else in common than toppling him. The two parties on the far right, those of Lieberman and Naftali Bennett, Netanyahu's former chief of staff, were joined by Labor and the far left Meretz. And for the first time, an Arab party, whose 5 seats were needed to reach 61, entered the coalition. These Palestinians sat with politicians advocating the expansion of Jewish settlements in the West Bank. Anything to get rid of Bibi. Now, throughout the 19-month rule of this fragile government, the pro-Netanyahu opposition loudly protested the participation of an Arab party, even though it largely represented moderates seeking to improve health, housing, and technology in their sectors. The Bennett-Lapid administration was also hurt by an unexpected outbreak of violence between Jewish and Arab civilians on the streets of mixed Israeli cities, such as Lod and Akko, not in the territories, in Israel proper. This resulted in deaths, injuries, burning of 10 synagogues. All of this helped drive up the vote of the new radical right Netanyahu bloc. Now, who are Bibi's new partners? They are strongly influenced by Messianic Zionism, which surged after the miraculous victory in the Six-Day War. It holds that the rule of fundamentalist Judaism over all of the Holy Land will bring divine redemption, and that everything else, including the laws of the state, is subordinate, even a threat to that sacred purpose. And before we get to them, I see was a question I do want to clarify. Arabs within Israel proper who vote, they're called Israeli Arabs. I use the word Palestinians. They're not all that. They're certainly not all Muslims. Anyway, the ones within Israel proper, Israeli Arabs, right? The ones in the West Bank and Gaza, you can call Palestinians. Okay, just wanted to make that distinction. Let's look at the next slide. The religious Zionist leader, Bezalel Smotrich, 42 years old, lives with his wife and 7 children in a West Bank settlement of questionable legality. Now you see on the top, you see his official picture. He looks like a very personable guy, but the photo below shows that he can be very testy, and he's often involved in heated exchanges with other members of Knesset. In his 20s, he was found with 200 gallons of gasoline, which police claimed was intended to blow up a highway in protest of Israel's pullout of Gaza. He was jailed for 3 weeks, but then released. He next began to express a loathing of the LGBTQ community. In response to Israel's annual gay parade, he organized a parade of his own, of donkeys and goats, in order to equate homosexuality with bestiality. He now says he regrets that, but recently referred to himself as a proud homophobe, and then apologized for that. He detests non-Orthodox Judaism and calls the Reform movement a fake religion. Last year, he spun the wild conspiracy theory that the Shin Bet, essentially the Israeli FBI, that the Shin Bet was responsible for the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. But his main target is the Palestinians. His oft-stated goal is to force the 2.5 million Arabs in the West Bank to emigrate or accept subjugation. He proposes segregating Arab and Jewish women in maternity wards throughout Israel, saying, it's natural that my wife would not want to lie down next to someone who's just given birth to a baby that might want to murder her baby in another 20 years. He is the new finance minister, even though he has limited fiscal experience. In this capacity, he can funnel large amounts of money to the settlers, even to their militias. He is also one of the defense ministers, with a portfolio designed especially for him, sharing authority with the army over the civil administration in the West Bank. Following a recent Palestinian terrorist attack that murdered 2 Jewish brothers, 400 settlers rampaged through the West Bank town of Huwara, killing 1 Palestinian, injuring dozens of others, torching and ransacking hundreds of homes. Smotrich responded that the town should be wiped out, although he later said his remarks were taken out of context. On his recent trip to Washington, no administration official would meet with the finance minister, and only one Jewish organization, Israel Bonds, agreed to host him. 73 American Jewish agencies publicly declared they wanted to have nothing to do with him. Last week in Paris, only days before Ramadan, he declared there's no such thing as a Palestinian people. His podium was draped with a map, including within Israel's borders, not only the West Bank and Gaza, but also the whole country of Jordan. Let's look at the next slide. Another provocateur is Itamar Ben-Gvir, also a West Bank settler, the leader of a small party called Jewish Power, which joined with the religious Zionists for the election, as I mentioned before. He has been a lifelong disciple of Meir Kahane, the fanatic Brooklyn rabbi who moved to Israel, where he was convicted of terrorism and served 6 months in prison. Kahane was later elected to Knesset, possible because the electoral threshold then was only 1%. And he called for forcibly expelling the Arabs. The other MKs, including Begin, shunned Kahane. When he got up to speak, they all walked out of the chamber. Ben-Gvir, as a teenager, headed the youth group of Kahana's party, soon designated as a terrorist organization. For that reason, he was not allowed to join the Israeli army. In 1995, weeks before Rabin's assassination, he publicly brandished a hood ornament stolen from the prime minister's car and exclaimed, "We got to his car, we'll get to him too." In the following decade, he was convicted of inciting racism and terrorism. And for 20 years, until he ran for Knesset, he hung in his living room a portrait of mass murderer Baruch Goldstein, who had killed 29 Muslims at prayer. At his rallies, Ben-Gvir's war cry was "Death to the Arabs," but he recently changed that to "Death to the terrorists." He praises his mentor Kahana to this day, although he says he no longer agrees with all his positions. Now, look at his campaign poster. This says, "Who is the landlord here?" Rather emphatic as to where he stands. Who is the landlord here? And on the eve of the recent election, Ben-Gvir tweeted a version of this to the Palestinians. He tweeted, "We're the landlords here. Remember that, I am your landlord." As if to prove it, only days after he took office, he made a provocative visit to the Temple Mount, the site of the first and second temples, but also the Alaska Mosque and Dome of the Rock, the holiest places in Israel for Muslims. This man, with no military or law enforcement experience, is now National Security Minister, overseeing Israel's police, and has an additional portfolio supervising the border police in the West Bank, where he could come into conflict with the Israeli army as well as the Palestinians. Now, in exchange for agreeing to yesterday's pause in judicial reform, Ben-Gvir demanded his own civilian militia. And it's been widely reported that Netanyahu acceded to that. Okay, you can remove that now. The third extremist party, headed by Avi Maoz, is based on homophobia. He seeks to lift the ban on conversion therapy that he thinks can change a person's sexual orientation. Now, Smotrich and Maoz's defenders claim that the charge of homophobia is hypocritical. They point out that the Arab Party in the prior government was also intolerant of homosexuals, and there was no outrage from the progressives about that. Perhaps to deflect the charge of condoning homophobia, Netanyahu successfully backed an openly gay man for Speaker of the Knesset. Now to the sweeping judicial initiatives of the Netanyahu bloc. Certainly reform is needed because the Supreme Court's powers are nowhere spelled out, right? There's no constitution. And over the years, it has arbitrarily widened its jurisdiction. But the remedies proposed are so drastic that they could cripple the court and Israeli democracy itself. The provision regarding appointments to the High Court would have been voted on this week had there been no postponement. Currently, the 15 justices are chosen by a 9-member panel, and 5 of the 9 are independent jurists, 2 members of the Bar Association, and 3 sitting justices. The heart of the proposal would give MKs from the governing coalition a majority on the selection committee in filling the first two vacancies on the court and increase their power for further appointments. Because of the mandatory retirement age of 70, two openings are coming up soon, including Chief Justice. Although under attack for its partisanship, the High Court is actually balanced between liberals and conservatives, so its orientation would switch significantly. Now, let me mention two bills you may not have heard of that are in this package of reforms. One seeks to disempower the legal advisors that each ministry currently has. These are similar to general counsels in the United States, but in Israel, they are tenured civil servants and remain in their posts even as the makeup of the Knesset changes. The new proposal would have them appointed by cabinet ministers themselves, who furthermore would not be bound by their legal opinions. Another provision gives jurisdiction over civil matters to the rabbinical courts, which now primarily handle marriage and divorce. Both parties would have to agree to let the rabbis decide a civil matter. But ultra-Orthodox women might be coerced into this in cases of domestic abuse, for example, now adjudicated in secular courts. An employer could make a worker sign an agreement that any dispute would be settled by Jewish law rather than civil law. A landlord could require that of a tenant before signing the lease. Now, most important is the bill that would allow the Knesset by a simple majority to override a Supreme Court decision. Since there are no other checks and balances, which I've been stressing tonight, it opens the door to what Alexis de Tocqueville termed the tyranny of the majority. If the court's decisions can be revoked, what will be the recourse for women or minorities, gays, non-Orthodox Jews, Israeli Arabs, Palestinians in the West Bank, political dissenters, the disabled, the poor, many others? Many liken a parliamentary leader with no limits on his power, other than his own party and coalition partners, to Hungary's semi-autocratic president, Viktor Orban, who has close bonds with Bibi, by the way, and neutered the courts in his own country. Without judicial review, even property rights and investments could be at risk. And this is why the business sector is so worried. Hopefully, a compromise can be reached. Perhaps a vote of 2/3 of the Knesset to overturn a Supreme Court ruling. Now, 2 months ago, Israel's president, Isaac Herzog, declared his country on the brink of constitutional and social collapse. On the brink, indeed. We don't yet know if Israeli democracy will be eroded. It might withstand this assault. The actions of the extremists now in power could turn out to be more moderate than their inflammatory rhetoric. Netanyahu may be able to rein them in. The coalition may dissolve, as so often happens, due to internal unbridgeable disputes. Even within Likud, if 4 of its 32 MKs defect, Netanyahu loses his majority. There are encouraging signs. The throngs of demonstrators have largely been nonviolent and reflect a deep desire to save Israeli democracy. I'm inspired by their tenacity. Even as the progressive political parties have faded away, grassroots activists have filled the void. I've been talking tonight about the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Well, there's a fourth that is holding the rulers in check, namely the Israeli public. This groundswell won an impressive victory last night. And think back over the past 4 years. Despite the turbulence of 5 elections, there has been a peaceful and orderly transfer of power each time, which Americans in particular should appreciate after January 6th. So disappointment and angst are warranted, but not yet despair. Even so, Israel is moving away from the ethnic and religious pluralism and toleration valued by most American Jews. The level of discourse there has become even more vituperative than in the US. And it's not clear how a national consensus can be reached. Leading commentators like Tom Friedman have written that the Israel we knew is already lost, and the diaspora must go its own way. I don't agree. 75 years on, Israel is ingrained in Jewish civilization in a way that transcends the current government, even the system of governance. Zionism means the ingathering of exiles, Holocaust survivors, Mizrahi refugees, refuseniks from the former Soviet Union, immigrants from Ethiopia. Just in the past year, 50,000 Jews from Ukraine and Russia have made Aliyah. Zionism connects us to our ancient biblical heritage and has revived the Hebrew language, now spoken by half of world Jewry. Israel has spurred a Jewish cultural renaissance in art, music, and cinema, literature, scholarship, Sephardi folklore, and cuisine. Its scientists have made biotech and high-tech advances that impact the whole planet. Not least of all, statehood, so heroically attained only 3 years after the Shoah, and so ably defended ever since, has forever changed the age-old stereotype of the weak, passive, and homeless Jew. All of this, whether we realize it or not, is central to the pride in being Jewish felt by almost all of us. We may not be in Israel, but Israel is in us. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, for a remarkably comprehensive and cogent presentation, really covering a remarkable amount of context, past, and really explaining what's going on. We're all very appreciative. We have a couple of questions. First question is, do you feel that Netanyahu's government will eventually fail, and will there be new elections?
Okay, that's a really good question, and nobody knows the answer to that. It's unusual for a Knesset to go the full 4-year term, but I gave examples of how the government could fail. Let's say that, Likud, which has some moderates still, if just four Likud members of Knesset defect, that is, they don't vote for these plans, the government will fall. Or, one of these extremist parties can say, it's not, you didn't meet our promises, Netanyahu, and we are dropping out. The government will fall. You saw that he has 14 seats. He can only lose Avi Maoz of the Noam party. That's just one, but he can't lose either of the other two, Jewish Power or Religious Zionists. So it's possible. It's possible. Believe me, I'm rooting for that. But I don't know. I mean, let's look at it the other way. What would be their advantage to dissolving the Knesset? If there's a new election, they will lose now because they've been discredited. If there were a new election today, Netanyahu would not win. So why would they hold new elections? The religious Zionists would feel this is their only chance now. They may very well not come back the same way. And Likud would probably be out of power. So it's 50-50, I have to say.
Thank you. Another question, Fred. Without a constitution, on what does the Supreme Court base its rulings in Israel?
Isn't that the problem? There's no constitution. So as I mentioned, the Supreme Court's powers, its jurisdiction, is not clearly set. The Supreme Court in the last, I'd say since the mid-90s, has taken upon itself more and more and more power, even to disqualify ministers. They just disqualified Aryeh Deri in January. This is the head of the Shas ultra-Orthodox party. He is a twice convicted felon. And the court said he's not capable of running an Israeli ministry. He was given the head of the Department of Health. And after Smotrich, he's supposed to be finance minister, twice convicted of corruption. I mean, this is the proverbial, rooster guarding the hen house or something. Anyway, Supreme Court ruled 10-1. He cannot serve. Now, Netanyahu he refused to resign. Netanyahu did fire him, but these new laws would make it clear that the Supreme Court cannot intervene in that way. But right now, that's why reform is needed. Its powers are not clearly defined.
Thank you. Another question. What's the future of Israel if the Haredim and the Arabs, with their large numbers, gain control of the government? Seems bleak since the Haredim don't join the military.
Right. First of all, the Arabs do not have a demographic advantage. They have pretty much the same birth rate as the Jews as a whole. So also only once in the whole history of Israel have they even entered a coalition. And that was the Lapid government, right?
Government for last.
Yeah. Government, right. Only one time, and they weren't happy about that. And they actually left before the end of that 19 months. I don't see the Arabs, whether birth rate or anything, being a factor here in this. The Haredim, though, that's something else. Their rate of birth is extraordinary. It is exponential. In the 1950s, they only had a couple of percent of the Jewish population. And they now have a sixth, and with less than a generation, they're going to have a third of the population. So remember the chart that I showed of the number of seats of the parties. So they have 18, which is a lot. It could be a situation 10, 15 years from now where they have 25 seats.
Right.
So this is very serious.
Yeah. Thank you. Do you see the current situation as anomalous, or whether this is a preview of things to come, given the demographic changes you've referenced?
Right. That's an excellent question. And again, it's really hard to tell, but I'm leaning toward that this is a harbinger of things to come. Not just because of the demography, which itself is really running in a certain direction, but because of these other factors, that security is so paramount, and that these parties, extreme right-wing parties, are able to pander to people's fears about that. Now, obviously, some of the fears are justified, there's no question. But when the remedy that they want is, to expel the Arabs forcefully or something like that, it's really terrible. And I'm afraid that it's more likely that this is going to continue. This is, round one, right, was won last night, but I'm afraid that these two sides essentially are on a collision course. I just don't see how there is a national consensus that can be built. I pray that it can. Right now, I just don't see how it's put together.
Thank you. Question, what can we do as Americans to best influence Israel to move towards democracy, in your opinion?
That's an excellent question. I've come to the conclusion that Netanyahu doesn't care that much about American Jews. I think he feels his real constituency in America is the evangelical Christians, who are very pro-Israel, largely for their own theological reasons. He feels the American Jews are, 3/4 of them are Democrats. Most of them criticize his programs, would like to see a different regime there. So it's going to be hard, it can be very hard to influence them. Now, there are people in the big cities, even here in New York, where I'm speaking to you from, American Jews who go out and protest, I personally just have a problem with that because I don't live there. I just don't, I can't put my finger on exactly why, but emotionally, I just don't feel like going out and carrying a sign and protesting. Here's what we can do. Let me suggest a couple of things. First of all, be engaged. Even if you don't know Hebrew, you can read the Israeli press in English translation. You can read Haaretz, you can read Times of Israel, you can read Jerusalem Post. Try to stay informed and follow what's going on. And then you can try to support organizations in Israel that reflect your own values. There are many organizations that are fighting for human rights, that are trying to provide broad education to the public, all sorts of positive goals. Look through that. Feel that, whatever you feel best reflects your own values. You can contribute to such an organization. But I've never felt as much as I do now, the difference between living there and not living there. I have so many friends who I knew at Berkeley when I was a graduate student. I was in a Zionist youth group. About half made Aliyah. And the investment they made, I've kept in touch with them. It's tremendous. It's not only that they live there, they fought in the army, right? They joined the army. They raised children there. They started businesses there. And so I'm trying to support them, just listening to what they have to say and trying to give them courage to continue.
Yeah. Thank you. Very insightful, and gives us some direction and some hope. You noted how in this last election, the parties on the left blundered because of their divisiveness and missed out. Somebody asks, if new elections were to be held, do you have any sense that they would learn from their mistakes and do better?
I really hope so, because their mistakes were just massive. I mean, there's just no excuse for that. My friends in Israel were just furious that labor and Meretz did not run together. I mean, that's just waste of 3 seats, I really hope they've learned from it. Maybe they will run together. But even so, that's no guarantee. Look at the way the trend is going, right? Labor got only 4 seats. Even if with merits they've gotten 7, what is that really? I don't think we can count on the left, even if they get their act together in terms of political parties. Because it's really, as I said before, we're past that. It's not between left and right, you know, it's between the center. And maybe the center, you know, boosted by these demonstrations and strikes, maybe they can be energized, you know, and with a little bit on the left, maybe they can work towards forming a coalition.
Thank you. There's a question about what information might you have about the power of this new National Guard? Are there any restrictions on when and how this militia can be activated?
Right. I think it's all in the formative stage. I'm not 100% sure that Netanyahu is really going to let him have Ben Gvir. Ben Gvir claims he's been, you know, promised it. Who knows? It's supposed to be a civilian militia. And I don't know the details of how that's going to be organized. I would assume it would be radical right-wing settlers that would join this. And it's terrifying to think of Ben Gvir in charge of something like that in the, you know, combustible West Bank. I'm hoping that somehow Netanyahu can neutralize this.
Thank you. This is a different kind of question, but there were a number of people who said that they were planning on going to Israel in May and in June and this summer, and were concerned that with all the demonstrations that, you know, this might not be a good time in terms of then being able to get to places they want to see, especially people visiting Israel for the first time. Any feelings about that?
Yeah, I would encourage you to go. I really would. We don't have violence in the streets, at least not yet, right? These massive demonstrations, they have been nonviolent largely. I mean, sometimes the police have shot water cannon, right, and tear gas, so on, but the protesters themselves, you know, angry as they are, they have not been violent.
Right.
Now, yes, you could be inconvenienced, sure. I mean, look, yesterday they closed the Ben Gurion airport, right? Mass strike. You could be inconvenienced. I think that's not as important a consideration as to what you would get out of a visit to Israel now. You can talk to people. You can really get a sense of what's going on. You can support the people who you think are, have the same values as you have. This is the time to go. This is not, I think, not the time to stay home.
Thank you. Somebody asked if you would compare Israel's judiciary with other parliamentary democracies without constitutions and with constitutions.
It's just trying to get my thoughts together on that. There are some other parliamentary democracies, both with constitutions and without constitutions, that have the Supreme Court selected by politicians, like the United States, right? The president nominates and the Senate has to confirm. There are no representatives of the Bar Association, right? None of the sitting justices have any say in that. So that's often brought up by the proponents of this reform, saying people elected by the public should have a say. However, that's different. It's different in Israel and the United States, because in the United States, there are many other checks and balances that are in place. In Israel, that's not the case, as no constitution, for example. So that's why if you have the Knesset also, in a sense, essentially appointing the justices, then you're really co-opting the judiciary. So as for countries without constitutions, nothing comes to mind right now. I mean, this is getting into political science, weeds of political science. I could do some research on that, and my email is there right under my name. If you can send me an email with that question, I'll be glad to give you an answer.
Thank you. Thank you. I realize the hour is getting late, and we appreciate your 3 hours ahead of us, and so generous with your time and your insights. Thank you so much. Thank you for this amazing presentation.
Hey, thank you, really. I really appreciate this conversation, these excellent questions. Thank you.
So that brings this presentation to a close. Again, we want to thank the Contra Costa JCC under One Tent for making this happen. To Reva Gambert in particular, again, the person that has just does so much for our community. We are so grateful. And thank you all for coming and being a part of this.
Thank you.
Laila Tov.
Ag Sameach.
Ag Sameach.